In the last 2 weeks, leaders of the broader Western alliance have gathered twice, at the Nato Summit in Washington, D.C., and the European Political Community Summit at Blenheim Palace, here in the UK. At both gatherings, the chief topic of conversation was the reliability of everyone's most crucial partner, the United States. It was already understood that this year's US presidential election, shaped as a contest between an obviously unhinged convicted criminal and an evidently declining age-wearied incumbent. Events of the last couple of weeks in particular have focused attention on the suboptimal nature of these options. Donald Trump narrowly survived an assassination attempt before accepting the Republican nomination with a convention speech which made little sense even by his rarefied standards of meandering gibberish. Joe Biden, after a series of embarrassing gaffes and awkward freezes, faced increasingly unsubtle pressure from his own Democratic Party to step aside for someone born since World War II, perhaps even after the Korean armistice. In this special episode, recorded partially in Washington, D.C. during the NATO summit, we take a look at the United States' willingness and ability to assume its traditional, if substantially self-appointed role as leader of the free world at this self-evidently challenging global moment. On a scale from 1 to women and children first, how much should America's allies be worried? How much difference could the election of a less obviously debilitated leader make? And if the United States won't be democracy's arsenal anymore, who will? This is the Foreign Desk.
American power can be used in order to protect our democracy, our way of life here in America, but also to advance democracy and human rights for all peoples all over the world. And I think most Americans also, frankly, deep down want this vision for America, but many of them can become disillusioned without the right leadership.
We live in a world where optics and vibes are everything now. You know, it's unfortunate that Biden looks the way he looks, that he shuffles and he's, old and he has to take more deliberate steps. But I think compared to a sweating, bellowing sociopath with bronzer slathered all over his face, I think for a sensible American, the choice is pretty clear. But sure, it does matter.
The budget of the National Endowment for Democracy doubled during the Trump administration as an expression of not Americans, again, here to tell you what to do, but to double down on saying we're with you and supporting you in your struggle. It was easy to be a trope that democracy promotion means to show up with troops in Iraq.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller. Last week's NATO summit in Washington, D.C. may be remembered as the beginning, a beginning of the end of Joe Biden's presidency. The noise in the media center when he introduced President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine as President Putin can only be likened to the groan that emanates from a football ground stadium when a player takes aim at an open goal from 2 meters and hoofs it into row K. On the sidelines of the summit, I spoke to Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute. I began by asking Evelyn if President Biden's performance at the summit was the effective advertisement for American leadership that it might have been.
Well, I do think, first of all, there was counter-programming by our adversaries, so by Vladimir Putin, President Xi. Unfortunately, we have in our midst Viktor Orban, who's really not acting as a Democrat and definitely providing a solace to those adversaries and helping them with their counter-messaging. I think with regard to what's happening domestically in the United States, it was a distraction, but on balance, again, we pulled off a wonderful summit, a celebration, and I do think that the American people appreciated it. I hope that the world understands, though, because of the counter-programming, what a dangerous place we are in today. So yes, the alliance is strong, but we have to be even stronger if we're going to prevent another world war, frankly.
Let's talk about that particular crisis. And you're referring, of course, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's ongoing onslaught against Ukraine. You were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia at the moment of the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2014. I mean, obviously, I'm not blaming anybody for not making decisions at the time with the benefit of what they've learned since. But in retrospect, do you think that was taken seriously enough, not just by the United States, but by the wider, hopefully democratic West? It just occurred to me when I was thinking about this earlier, it is incredible. In 2018, Russia hosted the World Cup.
Yeah. I believe that the answer to your question is yes. If we had taken Russia more seriously and we had armed Ukraine much more actively I was one of the people in the Obama administration arguing for lethal weapons, defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. We should have given lethal offensive weapons to Ukraine then too. So we could have provided Ukraine with more. We certainly could have provided Ukraine with more even under the Biden administration in the earlier days because we saw Russia arraying on the border. Our system got used to a certain drumbeat, a certain pace, a certain bureaucratic process, frankly. And I think if we had recognized the real danger that Putin would up the ante, we certainly would have provided more assistance. I think that's the lesson, though, of deterrence. You know, you can't calibrate your deterrence. It's better to overarm and take the risk maybe of spending a little more. And I understand budgets are budgets and you don't want to short shrift your domestic and your other priorities. But at the end of the day, if you want to ward off a war, it's important to make sure you invest properly. And Vladimir Putin is someone who only understands real firmness and real resistance to whatever it is that he's trying to do and the cost of whatever that is. Not any kind of diplomacy, not any kind of persuasion.
But in the conversations that were going on in the administration in 2014, and I guess what you've seen of them since, is it that, I mean, it is pretty much eternal since the founding of the Republic, that conversation between should the United States project itself and its values in the world, or should the United States concern itself mostly with its own affairs, that isolationist tendency, which has always been there? Do you think it is the isolationist tendency that is maybe having a bit of a moment over the last decade or so?
Yes, absolutely. And it's upsetting to those of us who are pro-engagement. You know, I run the McCain Institute. Senator John McCain was a hero, a war hero, coming out of the Vietnam War, he had been held prisoner of war over 5 years. He understood that American power can be used in order to protect our democracy, our way of life here in America, but also to advance democracy and human rights for all peoples all over the world. And I believe, and I think most Americans also, frankly, deep down want this vision for America, but many of them can become disillusioned without the right leadership. They don't understand when we make mistakes, how we can learn from those mistakes, and how we can, on balance, continue to be a force for good, working together with our allies in the common interest. And unfortunately, both on the left and the right, the forces of isolationism have gained currency in the United States. And it's understandable. We had, frankly, these very controversial wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at great cost in terms of the lives, American lives, allied lives. Also, of course, injuries, both mental, traumatic brain injuries and physical injuries, mental illness, PTSD, and, of course, the loss of lives in those countries. So looking at those wars, Americans became more disgruntled, more dissatisfied with America's role in the world and thought, well, maybe on balance we should withdraw, except when you consider that we've remained engaged in a non-lethal way all around the world, deterring, providing humanitarian assistance, conducting diplomacy, development. So I think that it's a question of articulating to the American people how American power can be used and using it judiciously, and first and foremost, deterring, using our military to deter the bad guys like Vladimir Putin.
Which does bring us to the prospect of, I guess, the restoration of Donald Trump and the party that he will bring back to power with him if he is re-elected. It's a thing I've been curious about, and you're a lot closer to it, so I'd be interested in what you think about it. I'm old enough to remember that if there was one thing you could rely upon, it would be that the Republican Party would stand behind a European country which was being besieged, plagued and pillaged by Russia, whereas the modern Republican Party seems to be at best equivocal on the subject. What's your idea, and perhaps if you ever heard of it, what was Senator McCain's idea of where this fondness for Russia and for Vladimir Putin within the GOP has come from?
Well, I think it all stems from or largely stems from Donald Trump, although I believe that the Russians actively engaged in trying to win over supporters in our political establishment using money, using campaign contributions and indirect campaign contributions. We know that members of Congress traveled to Moscow. We don't know what was said in those meetings, and I'm not going to imply that everyone who goes to Moscow or everyone who went to Moscow was a potential collaborator or collaborator, but the Russian government has worked very hard to curry favor with certain members of the Republican Party, and first and foremost, of course, is Donald Trump. He has an affinity for Vladimir Putin, an admiration for Vladimir Putin. He dismisses the fact that Vladimir Putin is a bloody killer, a human rights violator in the first order, and prefers to, frankly, do things and say things that he believes would please Vladimir Putin. And this is dangerous because the Republican Party has come under the sway of Donald Trump because he's a populist leader. He's convinced the rank and file of the Republicans who vote for Republican members of Congress and, of course, President Trump to support him and his populism. The people who follow Donald Trump, who go to his rallies, have come to believe in his America First isolationism and his, frankly, white nationalist kind of populist approach to America and what America should stand for. So that is regrettable. That is, I think, how I would imagine John McCain saw it. I can't speak for John McCain, but certainly Senator McCain was very clear that America is a country that is strong because of its immigration, that stands up to, he understood who Vladimir Putin was. He was famously quoted for saying, I looked into his eyes and I saw the letters KGB. He knew this is not a good guy. This is, that Russia under Vladimir Putin is working counter to U.S. interests. People like John McCain understood what U.S. interests are. Donald Trump, unfortunately, conflates his interests and Vladimir Putin's interests and works counter, frankly speaking, to U.S. interests.
On that subject then, and give or take the outriders at the wilder fringes of the Republican Party and the Trumpist tendency, do you think that despite all that a bipartisan foreign policy consensus, for better and for worse, does still exist in the United States?
I do, yes. And you see it in the votes for assistance for Ukraine. You see it, of course, much more clearly in the Senate because in the House you have some loud fringe voices. But on balance, we still have a bipartisan consensus that the United States must remain engaged. It's very clear when you look at our policy vis-a-vis China. There's really agreement between Democrats and Republicans, even on the fringes of certainly the Republican Party, that China is an adversary and that we need to make sure that we counter China strongly, whether it's on trade or with regard to their military actions in the South China Sea. So broadly speaking, there is consensus still in the United States.
That was Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute. You are listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The last couple of weeks have been a bracing reminder of the importance of the physical bearing of the President of the United States. Joining us now from Rhode Island is Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic. Tom, there have been those two great gatherings of the US and or its allies recently, those NATO and EPC summits. Should the non-American leaders who attended those now have one thumb on the panic button or both?
One. So far, because the race here is in flux. But I wouldn't blame Europeans for thinking about putting that second thumb on the button, because the Republican Party is proving yet again that there are millions of people who find the Trump-Vance isolationist message tempting and appealing because they don't really understand foreign policy and they don't really understand America's place in the world. So it's worth one thumb. It's understandable if we go to two, but it's not over yet.
If the Republican Party under Donald Trump does not prevail in November, is the assumption therefore, do you think, that that would not really disrupt transatlantic relations? I do want to discuss the particular frailties of Joe Biden shortly, but would a Democratic victory in November be essentially a victory for business as usual?
I think so. And I think if the Democrats win, whether it's Biden or anybody else, That's the end of Donald Trump. I'm finally confident saying that that would, be the end of Donald Trump. He's almost 79 years old. And I think to some extent that would end some of this transatlantic tension, because some of the things that Trump talks about are very specific to him. His fear of Putin, his disdain for NATO and Europe. The Republican Party has taken on a lot of that coloration in order to serve Trump. But even within the Trumpy Republican Party, it's really not natural. It's not a natural place for most Republicans to be, even now. So I think if Trump were defeated, a lot of that would dissipate.
Just before we move off the subject of Donald Trump, you will have been aware that there was this narrative that certain people close to him have been trying to float since the events of last Saturday, that his brush with death has changed him, that he will henceforth be a more humble and inclusive figure. Did you detect any of that in his curious peroration at the Republican National Convention?
No, anybody who bought that line should be disabused of it after watching the longest convention speech any Republican has ever given. It was a reminder that he is a mentally unstable, narcissistic autocrat. He hasn't changed one bit. I mean, he did all the greatest hits, all the grievance, all the name calling for well over an hour. So there's no change there. He's who he always has been, except now he thinks that his life has been spared by God and he's appointed by the Almighty to go and do whatever it is he thinks he's supposed to be doing.
I do want to look at the other side of the aisle and what that tells us about the importance of American leadership, because just as in 2016, it's arguable that Donald Trump had the good fortune to run against the only Democrat he could possibly have beaten, the same may be the case in 2024 if there is not a change on the ticket. There are whisperings, of course, that Joe Biden is being eased off the ticket by his fellow Democrats, although ultimately the decision will have to be his. If you try and look at this yourself from the outside in, are there Democrats who leap out at you as people who might play as reassuring figures on the world stage in particular?
I think at this point, almost any of them, especially when you have to consider the alternative. But the Democrats are a liberal institutionalist party. Now, it's kind of strange to say this, but the Republicans and the Democrats have changed places from where they were, say, in the late 1970s. And the Republicans are the party of, constantly presenting foreign policy and defense expenditures somehow in direct opposition to well-being at home. Build schools, not tanks, send our money to Ohio instead of Ukraine. The Democrats are the ones who are talking about leadership, global stability, the international order. So frankly, I just don't think there's any Democrat that really worries me about that. I mean, heck, Bernie Sanders could become president. You'd still have a better transatlantic policy than Donald Trump at this point.
We should perhaps not tempt the fates like that. But the last couple of weeks have been a reminder, though, of just how much authority and prestige is centered in the figure who occupies the Oval Office. I mean, do you think that it is important to American prestige, authority, whatever, the physical bearing of whoever is doing that job, whether you agree with them or not? Is it important that they look like they're strong and competent? I mean, ideally, they actually are strong and competent as well, but do the optics matter, do you think?
Oh, sure. We live in a world where optics and vibes are everything now. And I think that's unfortunate, but I'm also a realist, and it's true. And I think, it's unfortunate that Biden looks the way he looks, that he shuffles and he's, old and he has to take more deliberate steps. And he's definitely a guy who's lost more than a step in 4 years. But I think compared to a sweating, bellowing sociopath with bronzer slathered all over his face, I think for a sensible American, the choice is pretty clear. But sure, it does matter. I mean, think about when JFK became president and he was just the model. Now, we know this wasn't true. His health was actually terrible. And he was, whacked up on a cocktail of drugs for his Addison's disease and his back pain and other things. But he presented the image to the world of a young, vibrant president who was leading a country that itself was young and vibrant and coming into its own as a powerful and mature superpower.
This election is being framed really by both sides in the United States as for the domestic outlook of the United States as the most important presidential election in a generation or whatever, and that is a perfectly makeable argument. But to internationalize this again, do you think the stakes are that high for the rest of the world?
I do think so. Under the American constitutional system, as people may know, the Senate has to approve treaties. The Congress passed a law that will prevent Trump from withdrawing from NATO without the consent of Congress. However, under Article 2 of our Constitution, he is the commander-in-chief. So he can simply move troops or tell them to sit still or stay out of the way or come home. There are a lot of things that Donald Trump can do because he has a real animus toward Ukraine and toward NATO and toward transatlanticism in general. And so despite the fact that people are kind of trying to Trump-proof our foreign policy, because he will only be president for 4 years at most, unless he figures out a way to get around that.
What did I say about tempting fate, Tom?
I know, but at this point, Andrew, everything seems possible. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a real worry about how much damage he could do and how cozy he will be with authoritarians. And I think the other thing people have to realize about Trump is he won't come in here alone. This time there will be no adults. There will be no Jim Mattis. There will be no Rex Tillerson. I mean, I think Rex Tillerson was one of the worst secretaries of state there ever was. And now I'm pining for him. Now I'm nostalgic for him if Donald Trump gets elected. But there will be none of those people in the room. That there will be a real bottom of the barrel of cronies and goons that will come in with him. And I think, it is to my shame as an American that I say that, but it really worries me. And I would understand our allies being very worried about that as well.
Tom, thanks as always. That was Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Finally, on today's show, rightly or wrongly, helpfully or otherwise, the US has long positioned itself as the world's ultimate democratic backstop. Also in Washington, I spoke to Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. I began by asking Damon if he agrees with the idea that there is a global backslide of democracy and of general enthusiasm for the concept.
We're in a tough moment for democracy and freedom around the world, no doubt. If you look at reports like Freedom House and others that track this, technically we are in almost the 18th year of what can be called a democratic recession, in which more countries are moving away from democratic norms than towards. But it's actually even a little bit more significant than that. It's not just backsliding in democracies. We're in an era of where there's an active assault on democracy. And we're seeing a very assertive effort from authoritarian regimes, not just to repress their own people, but to understand that they've understood that to be safe at home, they've got to push back on the concept of democracy globally. And so we're in a moment where we see democracy under assault from authoritarian regimes increasingly working together, both to back each other up, but also to erode democratic norms throughout the world. So it is a moment.
How much more precarious does it make things if there is a perception that the United States is starting to lose interest in the idea?
Well, look, I think it is significant that established democracies have often sort of provided a sense of North Star for many around the world. But I think what we see in this era where we would be having challenges now without China that would be backsliding some populism, which is part and parcel of the fabric of the history of democracies, including the United States. But because of the self-correcting mechanisms built into democracies, the responsiveness to people and their institutions, these are sort of things that democracies can manage, established advanced democracies can manage. But because we're in an era of more hostility towards it, it's a bit more dangerous. So part of what it does for us at an organization like the National Endowment for Democracy, it underscores what we've always said. We're not in this business as Americans to tell others what to do for how to shape their democracies, how to be like an American democracy. We're in this together. People that believe in democratic values and institutions, it's a struggle. And for us, it reinforces the humility we bring to the work of how do we support each other? How do we support others in their democratic aspirations, in their countries and their cultures? And so while there's a period of rockiness in the United States, established democracies around this, it sort of underscores that small d Democrats have to back each other up and support this globally.
But do you think that there is a profound shift going on in the United States? There was a Gallup poll in January, which I think said only 28% of Americans are satisfied with U.S. democracy as it is, which is a historic low. I mean, I suppose it's arguable that that is a social media-driven phenomenon of people not quite understanding that democracy is not there to give you personally absolutely everything you want. But nonetheless, it's fairly clear that given a very strong possibility of the result in this upcoming presidential election, that quite a lot of Americans are broadly fine with the idea of a broadly authoritarian government.
Well, I'd take issue with that generalization. I don't think it's that simple by any means. But I think part of the way that I look at this is that the unsatisfied nature of electorates, of citizens, especially young generations, is the vehicle of positive change in open societies. And it is the frustrations, it is the lack of being comfortable with the status quo that drives change in societies. It is the source of social movements over time that actually serves as a self-correcting function, allows democracies to be responsive to their people. It is an era in which, because of polarization that is fueled by a new technological information environment that incentivizes this polarization, that it feels sharper. And yet, if you've got any historic perspective, for almost any American, I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. If you're a black LGBTQ citizen in Charleston, South Carolina, you've never enjoyed more freedom than you do today than at any single point in the history of the United States. Now, are people satisfied? No. Is that a good force for change? It is. It really is. But I think we can also lose perspective on what it means, the kind of freedom and openness we have in our society, as opposed to what it means to live in a not free society, in an authoritarian state.
In the world as it is now, and especially if you think back about the interventions the United States has made, most obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan, with at least some idea that you would be promoting democracy in those hitherto undemocratic countries, what has been learned, do you think, about how not to do it?
You're talking to the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. In some respects, we're the exact opposite of what it means to use military force to achieve objectives. The entire premise of our organization is that the simplicity of simply supporting people with their own aspirations, for their own desires for change in their own societies, that ultimately that is the most authentic and sustainable and effective way to support democracy. And so I think part of what our country, our political leadership has really experienced is that there is real power in that. And so you will have seen that the support for democracy, the investment in others' democracies, has really gone up pretty dramatically. In fact, the budget of the National Endowment for Democracy doubled during the Trump administration as an expression of not Americans, again, here to tell you what to do, but to double down on saying we're with you and supporting you in your struggle. That's, I think, something that crystallized because it was easy to be a trope that democracy promotion means to show up with troops in Iraq. Well, that's not how it's done. And that certainly isn't how it's done effectively. And I think that's the nature of the work that we do, where we've seen actually growth in political support, not a decrease in political support.
I mean, has it become any harder or perhaps even any easier to do it like that, to promote democracy in the, I guess, using American soft power as the means of promoting it? Do you still encounter any resistance to ideas just because it's America promoting it?
I actually disagree with you. It's not how we do it. We don't do it through American soft power. It's about finding the most driven people and organizations in their own societies who are not doing this for the United States. They're not doing this for donors. They're doing this for their family. They're doing this for their community. I mean, look how many people are taking the risk that end up being political prisoners, that are facing the boots of repression in their society. They're not doing this for America. And so the whole idea, it's not American promotion of democracy. It's a question of, does America sit on the sidelines and say, we're sorry that y'all are in prison, we're sorry that your regime is cracking your heads? Or do we say that we're willing to provide some modest, both moral and material support for people and recognize that the people represent the sovereignty of their nations, not just maybe a captured elite or a dictator. And so I think it is with a heaping dose of humility that this work is something that actually enjoys quite deep support, because it isn't the concept of America out there promoting, telling people how to live their lives.
Especially at the moment, and especially given the potential consequences of this November's election, are there things the United States could be learning from other people's democracies at the moment?
I think that's always the case. Look, we've got a very particular democracy given our historic trajectory that makes things quite complicated. Our system was never meant to be a very easy one to navigate. It was built into lack of trust and this forced set of compromises. And so I've really been struck, if you watch the democratic life in a society like Taiwan that has used the embrace of technology, which has really been divisive in many societies, incentivizing polarization, and how you've seen the Taiwanese government use technology as a means of engaging more of the citizens in public life and road testing ideas and really getting input into concepts behind legislation and taking controversial ideas and having them work through society in a way that builds consensus. They're about to adopt some norms on digital policy that really grew out of a series of sort of independent from government, really mass mobilized digital engagement strategies that engage the population. And this is not in a particularly easy environment. So I think there's a lot to be learned if we look at how other democracies grapple with this, and it's always a place of learning. But look, let me just say, we're talking about this in what is a year of democracy. We have more than half of humanity going to the polls this year. And on the one hand, I'm not naive about that. Russians, Iranians, Belarusians have gone through so-called elections. But one of the things that's really powerful to think about, even these fake elections, is that the existential argument that legitimacy needs to be based in your people is one that has really taken root. So much so that so many autocrats and dictators have to go through the motions of elections. They have to manipulate the media environments to help brainwash or at least show this potential support of their people in a manipulated media environment and go through the mechanics even when a completely controlled electoral process. And yet it still is a year of elections that brings surprises. You see a vote in India that forced Prime Minister Modi into a diversified coalition as he lost support in his home turf. A vote in South Africa in which a dominant single party has now entered into a national unity government across the political spectrum. You've seen oppositions win after a lot of uncertainty in places like Senegal and Liberia, where maybe Macky Sall wasn't so keen to actually go to elections, forced to do so, elections that actually led to a former opponent in prison to be in power, a peaceful transition in Liberia, which is not so obvious, a democratic transition taking hold in Guatemala despite entrenched corrupt elite trying to prevent that. And so it's messy. It's difficult. We feel an authoritarian assault. We see the populace in action everywhere. And yet the power of the ballot and the power of creating space in which citizens engage, civil society can organize and maximize the space available to them, it is really important to help sustain that competition. We don't need to be naive about what it means in a regime like Iran, but we also don't need to be so cynical that we don't stand by the idea and the power of what the ballot can do when you can protect it. And that's where I hope Americans learn from others, and that you see incredibly high participation rates in many other countries in a way that has been lacking here in the United States. And we've seen an uptick, frankly. People are worried about democracy in the United States, and yet we have one of the most activated civic lives, civil society mobilization, voter mobilization than we have had in years. And that's actually a good sign for the health of citizens thinking that they need to be engaged if they want to shape the issues before them and address issues that they're not happy about. That is how we democracies get stronger. And it's why authoritarians who are not subject to that feedback loop can become brittle and make really devastating mistakes.
That was Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.